Welcome to Session 1 of Building Inclusive Schools. What is Inclusion? My name is Bonnie Dupuis, and I'm the Fin Facilitator for Fiddler's Fin Sunrise. Dr. Poinsettia Tillman is the Senior Manager for our department. When Anne Sullivan first worked with Helen Keller, she approached her with the presumption that she was competent, that Helen's problem emanated from her not having an effective means of communication. Even before Anne began to work with Helen, there was evidence of her desire to communicate. She used pantomime to show her interest in making ice cream or wanting toast with butter. But it was Anne's introduction of spelling and words that proved liberating for Helen. The principle of presuming competence is simply to act as Anne Sullivan did. Assume that a child has intellectual ability. Provide opportunities to be exposed to learning, and assume that the child wants to learn and assert him or herself in the world. During our time together, we hope that you will have an understanding of the history of education for people with disabilities and how it has led to current laws and research supporting inclusive education for all students, and give you some more information about the benefits of inclusive education for students with disabilities and the entire school community. A little history worth knowing. The first picture is of Carrie and Emily Buck in 1924. Carrie Buck was an 18-year-old patient at the Virginia State Colony for epileptics and feeble-minded, whose superintendent, Dr. John Bell, claimed that she had a mental age of 9. The doctor maintained that Buck represented a genetic threat to society. Emily Buck was her 52-year-old mother. As recently as 50 years ago, it was common practice for children and adults with disabilities to be segregated in institutions and other settings in the belief that they belonged with others of their own kind. In 1966, Burton Flack and Fred Kaplan published an historic photographic essay titled Christmas in Purgatory. The book exposed the deplorable conditions that existed in many institutions for children and adults with what was then referred to as mental retardation. In other day rooms, they wrote in the introduction, we saw groups of 20 and 30 very young children lying, rocking, sleeping, sitting alone. Each of these rooms was without toys or adult human contact, although each had desperate-looking adults standing by. Blatt and Kaplan hoped that by letting people see this situation, unknown to most people, things would change for the residents and the staff who cared for them. And it did. We used to think that children and adults with disabilities were better off with their own kind, should be kept away from the community, couldn't learn beyond the skills of daily living, were less valuable to society than those with disabilities. Long ago, education for students with disabilities was based primarily on the medical model. We need to fix them and make them normal before they could be integrated into society. As you view those photographs, think about how past curricular models were used in the institutions of yesterday. We used to think people with disabilities didn't need or couldn't make choices about their lives, even about food preferences or activities. Functional skills taught with their own kind and without real-world application. They thought they enjoyed jobs that were repetitive and meaningless, such as putting pegs in holes. It's as if they were in a perpetual state of childhood. For more information on ability awareness and history, check out the resource titled Disability, History, and Awareness, a resource guide available from the Florida Department of Education, Bureau of Exceptional Education and Student Services, otherwise known as BEES. This photo was taken at Sunland Institution, Tallahassee, Florida, in 1969, 3 years after Burton and Black published their essay. It shows an adult reading a book to several clients. Notice the cribs with lids in the background. While the photos from Christmas in Purgatory may be disturbing and thankfully outdated, current beliefs may still perpetuate old curricular models of education. This picture shows a student in a self-contained high school classroom for students with disabilities. He is learning to color a farm animal with the assistance of a peer buddy. Can you think of a reason why it would be important and meaningful for this teenager to learn how to color a cow? Disability advocates were inspired by other groups, such as women and African Americans, to end this kind of segregation, and all groups working for equal opportunity have seen access to quality education as the key. In July 2002, President George W. Bush created a commission to study effective special education practices for students with disabilities. One key finding of the commission's report is that children receiving services in special education programs should be considered as general education students first. Despite this fact, many educators and policymakers think about special education as a separate place rather than a service provided in natural and general education settings. Inclusion is: strength lies in differences, not in similarities. Take a moment to think about a time you felt excluded. Take a moment to think about a time you felt included. Inclusion is an easy thing to do poorly, and when we do it poorly, we reinforce the belief that this cannot work. Inclusion is the practice of educating individuals with and without disabilities together rather than separately. Inclusive education is a human right. Inclusive education is not an earned right. Research shows that most students in segregated school settings remain segregated in adult life too. It's easy to understand why. The readiness model sets the stage for lowered expectations at school. Students with disabilities must get ready in a setting with a few opportunities to learn and play with students who don't have disabilities and are typically seen as less competent and different. When they are finished at school, they are still not ready for college or employment or to live independently. The biggest benefit of inclusion education is that it starts with the assumption that the general education classroom and curriculum are the best options for high learning expectations. And educators in inclusive schools presume that all students are competent and can learn in the general education classroom. They operate from a strong belief that access to equitable education is basic human civil right of every child. Inclusion means all students learning together, regardless of labels and ability levels. An atmosphere that promotes a sense of belonging, equality, acceptance, and individual worth, with appropriate supports and services, in collaboration with integrated services. People with disabilities, their families, administrators, teachers, and other school staff have helped define inclusive education throughout recent years. People are no longer surprised to find students with disabilities at the same neighborhood schools and in the same classrooms that students without disabilities attend. Inclusion is the practice of educating all students together, regardless of their abilities or labels. It is much more than putting students with disabilities in a general education classroom. The students must also be provided the appropriate supports to learn alongside their peers without disabilities. Family members and educators must work together to identify the services and supports needed to help each student. For many educators, the term inclusion conjures up negative images or experiences. Often, students with disabilities have been placed into general education classrooms without the appropriate supports or services provided in that setting. Why is this so? One major reason for the placement of students with disabilities in general education classrooms without appropriate supports is a lack of opportunity for special education teachers to adequately plan for and deliver supports with facilitated scheduling processes and follow-up. It's not educators working in isolation. And it's not students always grouped by their current readiness or ability. And it certainly isn't watering down the curricula. If students with disabilities are to be part of the whole school community, they need access to the same extracurricular activities and experiences as their peers without disabilities. Supports provided to students with disabilities in the general education classroom may also be needed in other settings. For example, a student with a hearing impairment may need a sign language interpreter to take part in the school play. Effective inclusion requires teachers to possess a strong knowledge and understanding of the curriculum they teach, be aware of their students' strengths and needs, and to provide curricular, environmental, and behavioral supports to enhance learning, and have mastery of and utilize highly effective instructional practices in classroom management, and regularly collaborate and communicate effectively with their general and/or special education peers. In Session 2 of Building Inclusive Schools, we will take a look at why inclusion is important. Please contact Dr. Poinsettia Tillman at the email listed above to schedule an appointment for additional support. Thank you.